So, and without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Daniel Polikoff. We're so happy to have him here today to talk with us about Rilke. Dr. Polikoff is a poet, translator, and internationally recognized Rilke scholar. His book on Rilke and archetypal psychology, In the Image of Orpheus, Rilke, A Soul History, was recently reviewed by both Jung Journal and Spring Journal. He has shared his knowledge of Rilke in many venues over many years. He delivered a talk on Rilke and Joseph Campbell, Die Unterholte Mitte, that was close, as part of a conference earlier this year in Mainz, Germany. He has Mainz? Okay. He has published 2 books of poetry as well as an edited translation of a dramatic version of the Grail legend, and lives with his family in Mill Valley. Welcome.
Thank you, Alexandra. And I'd like to thank the Jung Institute of San Francisco for graciously sponsoring this event, and also the Asheville Jung Center for making it available to a wider audience. And I welcome our webinar audience, which I understand is viewable through this little camera in front of me. Okay, so let's begin. Aus unbeschreiblicher Verwandlung stammen solche Gebilde. Fühl und Glaub, wir leiden's oft, zu Asche werden Flammen, doch in der Kunst zur Flamme wird der Staub. Such creations arise out of indescribable transformations. Feel and believe. We suffer it often. The flame turns to ash, and yet in art, dust is turned once more to flame. Rainer Maria Rilke and Carl Gustav Jung were both born in 1875. Yet the ground of their affinity does not stop there. They were both raised in strongly Christian households, and both wrestled mightily with the heritage of their religion, striving to come to an independent vision of spirituality. Both were dedicated to the quest of the individual soul for spiritual meaning, and in this respect, both might be considered inheritors of the Romantic tradition. In their explorations of soul, both explored the depth dimension of the psyche. Both were intrigued and deeply interested in pathologies of the psyche. Women were of supreme importance in both of their lives, both literally and also symbolically in terms of the relationship to the anima. And in general, it could be said that both were dedicated to the symbolic life in pursuit of wholeness. At the same time, Jung and Rilke pursued this quest in different modes. Jung as an analytic psychologist who founded that initiative, and Rilke, of course, as a superb lyric poet. Accordingly, their relationship to alchemy, the chief subject of this talk, differed. Jung engaged alchemy very consciously and explicitly, and of course it became, in a way, the centerpiece of Jung's psychology. Rilke, on the other hand, was not one of those poets like William Blake or William Butler Yeats, who consciously involved himself with esoteric or philosophical matters and did not really engage alchemy explicitly the way Carl Jung did. At the same time, the alchemical spirit, I think, is very much alive in Rilke's poetic work. And I think it is so in part because alchemy and poetry are so deeply connected on an intrinsic level. In fact, one might also almost say that poetry is a kind of alchemy. It's all about taking the lead of everyday experience and transforming it into some kind of imaginative gold. Take, for example, this little poem, not by Rilke, but I imagine many of you are familiar with it. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain water beside the white chickens. Very simple data of experience: a wheelbarrow, chickens, rainwater, the lead of experience. And yet through poetry, somehow the simple placement of those words gives it an imaginative weight and light. How does it do so? Well, the title of the first poem that I read in German and English was Magic by Rilke. And it is a kind of magic that affects that transformation in poetry. Reciprocally, I think it could also be said that alchemy is, well, if not a kind of poetry, certainly a kind of art. It's often spoken of as the holy art. Alchemy is not so much a theory of knowing or a system of knowledge as it is a process of making or creating something through transformation. Accordingly, the idea of the work or opus is central to alchemy as it is to any art, and that work requires a container. In alchemy, literally, this is the crucible. In poetry, the poetic form, be it a sonnet or an ode. And yet on another level, one can say this container is the individual consciousness of either the alchemist or the poet. And in both cases, there's an emphasis on individuality. Neither alchemy nor poetry lend themselves to some kind of creed that would make them function as a symbol system for a group of people. Every poem bears the unique signature of its author. And alchemists were reputed to be solitary individuals for the large part. The work itself is solitary. So those are certain affinities between poetry, deep ones, I feel, between poetry and alchemy in general. And given that Rilke is regarded by many as a lyric poet par excellence, one might expect that those features would be pronounced in his character and his work. And indeed, this is the case. As the kind of archetypal poet, Rilke was famous for his dedication to his work and to his solitude. The English poet Auden jokingly called Rilke the Santa Claus of loneliness. But of course, there was very serious and good reason for Rilke's dedication to solitude. It provided a kind of hermetic sealing of his psyche and his soul work, which was necessary to provide the crucible for the transformations, poetic and psychological, that played through his life. In a way, one can say that Rilke's poetic workshop was a laboratory of individuation. Correlatively, it's fair to say that Rilke was a spiritual poet, one who did acknowledge higher and more pure states of being towards which he, as a poet and man, aspired. At the same time, Rilke, although there was this urge toward transcendence in his work, was not a poet who looked towards a kind of transcendence of the earth, a ascension to heaven, or some embodied state as the goal of the work. He was very much a poet who valued immanence and was ultimately dedicated to the transformation of matter, of nature, and the soul here on this earthly plane. In his elegies, perhaps his most famous work, Rilke wrote, "Was, wenn Verwandlung nicht, ist dein drängender Auftrag? What is your most urgent task if not transformation. Again, in saying so, he was addressing the earth itself in that poem. This deep connection between Rilke and alchemy, or the opus, or the work of alchemy, the work of transformation, I think is ultimately borne out most materially by the degree to which Rilke's poetic opus, his life work, lends itself to an alchemical reading. That is, the degree to which his psychological and poetical development, and the two are certainly indissociable, might be understood in the light of fundamental alchemical principles and processes. And that is what I am going to try and work us through in the course of this talk, to proceed to try to shed some alchemical light on Rilke's poetic soul history. But where to begin? That's not such an easy question with Rilke. Rilke published 5 poetry collections before the age of 25. But at the same time, he was hardly a literary prodigy like his compatriot Hugo von Hofmannsthal. They're kind of rare in literature, but they do exist, and Hofmannsthal was one. Rilke most certainly was not, on the other hand. Rilke's earliest works tend towards the puerile, and the poet himself was wont to disparage them. Even so, these early works clearly form the point of departure for Rilke's mature work, and some are of real value. I'll give you just a taste of his earliest work by quoting a poem, like many of his early poems, it's untitled, from his third poetry collection, which is titled Traumgekrönt, or Crowned with Dreams. In the womb of a silvery snow night, all things slumber far and wide, except an endless wild woe awakes loneliness in a single soul. You ask why the soul holds silent, why she does not pour it forth into the night. She knows if it left her, the flood would put out all the stars. I think that gives a little bit of a sense of the kind of neo-romantic mode that Rilke was comfortable with in his earliest work, and which he inherited from his literary predecessors. But with that as just a bit of a background of his very earliest work, I want to begin our alchemical review of Rilke's oeuvre in earnest with a crucial yet little known work, one that remained unpublished in Rilke's own lifetime. The critic Siegfried Mandl writes, "In the life of every great artist is a watershed where creative energies are channeled away from the juvenile and begin to flow in mature directions. When an artist's early upbringing is saturated with piety, his complicated personal experience must find an outlet, if not resolution, in his writings." Mandl's alluding here to Rilke's visions of Christ, most of which was written in the years 1896 and 1897, so when the poet was 21 and 22 years old. This work was hugely important in Rilke's development because it was really in the visions of Christ that he tried to come to terms with his very vexed relationship to his Christian heritage, the religion of his childhood. Many of you may know that Rilke's mother, Sophia Rilke, who was a very important influence on Rilke, both positively and negatively, was an extremely pious woman who would have the little René, he was born as René Rilke, not Rainer, kiss the wooden statues of saints in the church and so forth. So his youngest years were really saturated with his mother's piety. And it was through the writing of the visions of Christ that Rilke most directly and powerfully tried to work through the conflicts that were entailed by what emerged through his adolescence to be a belief system he could not adhere to. The visions of Christ consists of 11 dream visions. Rilke himself sometimes called them dream epics or epic lyric fantasies, most all of which represent the figure of Jesus in various situations, often modern situations. The first vision, called Die Waise, or the Orphan, depicts a scene in a churchyard where we find a young girl alone. Her mother has just been buried. In fact, in the visions, we've just borne witness to a very unsatisfying service, which consisted of little more than the uttering of a few Christian platitudes before the heavy sods of earth were shoveled onto the poor mother. A rather sorry scene. So that the little girl who is now orphaned is naturally devastated, but she nevertheless clings to the belief that she will soon see her mother again in heaven. And then while she is kneeling there in the graveyard, she suddenly becomes aware of a figure nearby, a man who presents a rather desolate figure himself. But look, stock still against the churchyard wall, a man who seems to have no strength at all is leaning. In his great dark eyes are fed the fires of grief like candles for the dead. This is Rilke's first vision of Christ, and as you can gather from this description, Rilke's Jesus, for this is indeed he, is not a salvific figure, not any sort of fount of divinity or light, but rather more the opposite. He's a Christ who bears the burden of all the spiritual illusions trumpeted in his name, one whose hubristic aspiration to be not just a man, but divine, but a God, has, in Rilke's tragic rendition, cast him into a kind of spiritual abyss. Indeed, in the course of the visions, Rilke rather systematically deconstructs many of the pillars of conventional Christian belief. But psychologically speaking, how does he do this? What sort of process or what kind of operation is the Christian soul subjected to in the course of the visions, or at least to begin with this first one? Let's look for a moment at how Jesus is first presented, the imagery employed in representing him, especially his eyes, those windows of the soul. In his great dark eyes are fed the fires of grief, like candles for the dead. Well, one thing you might immediately notice is the fire imagery, and that provides a kind of alchemical clue for us. In his book, The Anatomy of the Psyche, which I'll draw upon frequently in this talk, Edwin Edinger writes, each of the four elements has its own particular operation. Calcinatio is the fire operation. Hence, any image that contains open fire burning or affecting substances will be related to the calcinatio. And later he adds, most lists of chemical operations begin with the calcinatio. Now, because we're taking the vision of Christ as a kind of point of departure for our Rilke itinerary, there is, in addition to the fire imagery, a certain plausibility of linking the visions with calcinatio, given what Edinger says about it often being viewed as one of the point of departures for alchemical work. But what is this calcinatio or calcination process, and how can it be related to what's going on in the visions of Christ? Technically, calcination involves the intense heating of a solid in order to drive out all the water and other constituents that will volatilize it, leaving a kind of a dry powder. How does this relate to Rilke's vision of Christ and the substance of Christian belief epitomized in them, in the figure of Jesus? Well, Jesus, as Rilke depicts him here, is really a kind of shell of a man, a shell of himself, his passionate belief in God, in himself, and his own divinity. And of course, this is always Rilke's own personal representation. I'm not vouching for the truth of his representations. They're the truth for him at that point in his life. So the passionate belief in God and all the other foundational elements of Christianity seem somehow to have been revealed as illusory, leaving Jesus as despondent, enervated, ashen, and literally burned out. And that's, in fact, many of the distinct visions can be understood as a kind of annihilation of one or another tenet of Christian faith, a kind of incineration of solid belief structures, like it goes up in smoke, the idea of heaven or the existence of God, and all the excess feeling and sentiment and piety that has been invested in this solid belief structure is incinerated, leaving a kind of desiccated residue. In this first vision in particular, it's the reality of heaven, the Christian heaven, that Rilke and his Christ call into question. The young girl is strangely drawn to the desolate Jesus, despite or perhaps because of his somber and even derelict appearance. The Christ exerts a kind of magnetic force in this vision. The two engage in some dialogue, and the vision ends with the newly orphaned child asking Jesus to confirm her one last remaining hope. She says to him, "Isn't it so?" The priest says, "She," her mother, "and I, you know it too, will meet in heaven someday." Her words drift off. There comes a cricket crying. She harks. A white moth flutters by. She harks. A shudder of smoke ascends the sky from distant huts. The man makes no reply. So Jesus' silence at this moment is deafening, and it's crushing for the young girl. And the imagery of this last passage, too, is interesting. Instead of some kind of fiery affirmation, which we might expect from Jesus, in response to the child's question, there's nothing but a white moth that flutters by. And what is that white moth like? It's like a flake of ash. It's like the dry powder that is the residue of the burning up of the beliefs that have just been annihilated. And instead of Jesus confirming some kind of grand ascension upwards, what goes upwards? It's only a shudder of smoke. Again, the residue of fire, which climbs towards the empty heavens. Edinger makes clear that the alchemical operations, most all of them, can be inflected positively or negatively, constructively or destructively. And the difference between the two is not always clear. In the Rilke kind of odyssey that we'll be going through today, I was going to associate two works with the Calcinatio. The first one we're paying attention to here, the Visions of Christ, and more briefly at the end, the Sonnets to Orpheus, which is Rilke's last great work. And I think it's fair to say that it's more the negative aspects of the Calcinatio that emerge in the Visions of Christ, whereas more positive ones do in the Sonnets of Orpheus, at the same time recognizing that that negative force it's not purely negative. It's also quite obviously purgative and purificatory, and playing in that way, playing a very critical role in Rilke's spiritual development. Now, whereas the first vision exemplifies a Jesus who's despondent and enervated and literally burned out, the second vision features a kind of alternative and complementary effect, a fiery Jesus full of bitter wrath, a Christ who's not quite yet burned out, but fuming, yea, flaming with anger and despair about what he has somehow come to discover as the falsity of his own beliefs. The second vision is called Judenfriedenhof, or at the Jewish cemetery. And the dramatic action of the vision takes place in a graveyard in Prague, and in fact, at the burial site of one of the great sons of Prague, Rabbi Loew, who was a famous Jewish rabbi of the Middle Ages, who was known not only for his piety and dedication to God, but also very, very relevantly in this vision for his occult knowledge. And we find in the vision Jesus at the site of Rabbi Loew's grave, bitterly lamenting the non-existence of the God that both he and Rabbi Loew had championed, the Judeo-Christian God. And this is Jesus haranguing God. It's amazing how many people spend extensive time in dialogue with a God that doesn't exist. And this is what Jesus is doing here in Rilke's portrayal. So, you had never been, or were no more, when I, poor wretch, set foot upon this shore. Why should the grief of men be my affair, when you, the great God, summon them before your throne no longer? When their pious prayer is only madness, since you'll not reveal your face, because you're not. Burning with rage, Jesus, in a kind of unchristian spirit, very uncharacteristic of usual image of the Christ, wants to revenge himself upon the world that's rendered homage to what he now recognizes as a false God. And I might interpolate here that at this point in his life, Rilke was significantly influenced by Nietzsche, and some of the kind of rage against the Christian belief structure, while certainly authentic to Rilke, was also imbibed through some of Nietzsche's writing. So at this point, as I said, Jesus turns rather vengeful, and he turns to the spirit of Rabbi Loew, who is represented by the graveyard there, and who, as I said, is an accomplished occultist. And directly invoking alchemy, Jesus requests a spell that might affect the incineration, the fiery purging of the world and the belief system that is invested in this belief system that has proved so false. And these are his words. In alchemy's old hearths, can there be burning no fire engendered by a special curse, fierce and unquenchable, forever turning its vengeful tongues to lick without remorse the utmost hinges of the universe? This passage mirrors a kind of last judgment scenario, which is another of the archetypal images that Edinger associates with the calcinatio, the burning off, the spectacular apocalyptic burning of all that doesn't pass muster. But ultimately, the fury that's exhibited in the second vision, the fury on the part of Jesus, and the desolation that's exhibited in the first, come to the same end. They're two sides of the same coin. And in fact, this vision, like the first one, ends with a moth, a flake of ash fluttering by, this time a black one instead of a white one. And it ends too with a kind of tragic sadness, Christ weeping on his knees. I think it's important to recognize that Rilke's visions of Christ, Christusvisionen, is not really a rejection of religion or spirituality in the name of some kind of atheism. Instead, as I've alluded to already, it seems psychologically a kind of burning off of the impurities of what for Rilke had become a false system of belief, one that he could not invest in, even though, as I said, as a young child, it was not only Rilke's mother who was very pious, but he very much imbibed her deep piety and prayed. And there's a story about the little René Rilke not being able to go to bed, to go to sleep one night, and his mother asked him why, and he said, well, I haven't given the dear God a kiss yet. You know, so that the piety went attached to the figures of Christianity went very deep in his psyche. So it was a momentous upheaval in the depths of his soul to turn against this belief system and to burn off the volatility of all the water, all the feeling that had been invested in that belief system. It's also worth saying that, like Jung, although Rilke rejected the orthodoxies of Christian belief, he remained in fruitful dialogue with Christianity and its images and symbols throughout his life. So there's a very active dialogue that doesn't simply end in a rejection. But it is true that in commenting on his visions, Rilke himself spoke of exorcising the terrifying devotional habits of my childhood, which threatened to take possession of my poetry. Interesting. The terrifying devotional habits of my childhood, which threatened to take possession of my poetry, the poetry standing there for his independent soul life. And the alchemical calcinatio affected in the visions certainly did prove a crucial step on the path toward making his poetry a vehicle for his authentic spirituality. The visions, in fact, I think it's fair to say, can be seen as paving the way for the deep spiritual sensibility that manifestly informs the poet's first widely heralded work, the first published work, which Rilke himself regarded as a vital and essential part of his opus. Now, the Visions of Christ, and I'll name that work shortly, the Visions of Christ furthered Rilke's evolution in more ways than one. In addition to the psychological meaning that I've been speaking about, it was also on the physical plane, the vehicle of his meeting the individual, the woman who was undoubtedly the single most important person in his life, and that is Lou Andreas Salome, who is pictured here. How many of you are at all familiar with Lou Andreas Salome? Great, quite a few. Okay. I guess I have to stand up straighter now. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. Right, so initially Rilke had been considering publishing the Visions of Christ, which he ultimately decided not to do for reasons I think you can probably imagine. But in the phase in which he was considering it, there was an editor, Michael Conrad, who read them and said, hey, you know, you really ought to look at this essay, Jesus the Jew, because it expresses a similar sensibility. That essay was by Lou Andreas Salome. Rilke did read it and was profoundly impressed by it. He said that it stood like reality to his dream of the visions of Christ, and determined to meet Lou, which he in fact did. And in May of 1897, when Rilke was 22 years old, and the two very quickly became very close. In fact, in a matter of weeks, they became lovers and embarked upon a period of roughly 3 years in which they were very intimate with each other on all levels: physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. And the intimacy of that relationship and the importance of it certainly can hardly be overestimated for Rilke's development in every which way. Something of the human intimacy, the powerful emotionality of the relationship comes through in a reflection that Lou Andreas Salome herself wrote some years after Rilke's death. Lou was actually 14 years older than Rainer Maria Rilke. She was 36 at the time of her meeting, but nonetheless outlived Rilke, who died at the relatively early age of 51 by some years. And in her memoirs, Lou has this to say about their relationship in that earliest phase of it. If I was your wife for years, and that's figuratively, they weren't married. In fact, Lou happened to be married to someone else at the time, but we won't go into that at the moment. If I was your wife for years, it was because you were the first truly real person in my life. Body and man indivisibly one, unquestionably the fact of life itself. I could have confessed to you word for word what you said in declaring your love. You alone are real. Thus, we were a couple even before we had become friends, and becoming friends wasn't so much a matter of choice as it was the fulfillment of that underlying marriage. We were not two halves seeking the other. We were a whole which confronted that inconceivable wholeness with a shiver of surprised recognition. We were thus siblings, but from a time before incest had become sacrilege. Pretty powerful statement, I'd say, and quite naked to put down. Now, Lou was a catalyst for Rilke's development in many ways, as I've mentioned, and one of those was that she was the catalyst of two journeys that Rilke took towards the end of the century, actually 3 journeys. One to Italy in 1898, which he took on his own, but it was in the aftermath of an intense period of study of Renaissance, which he pursued with Lou. They were studying the Renaissance together. And then she had went off, I think, for a time. Perhaps it was Russia, because she was Russian-born. And Rilke went to Italy on his own, but was charged with keeping a journal for Lou. And this was kind of the classic pilgrimage of the German poet to the Italian Mecca, the prototype of which is, was Goethe's Italian journey. And that journey was very important to Rilke, especially in connection with his self-consciousness of the dignity and sacredness of the artistic mission and the spirituality intrinsic in the act of creation. He reveled in the works of Michelangelo and other great Renaissance artists, and this was a very significant journey for him. Now, the other journey or journeys that Lou catalyzed were 2 journeys to Russia that they made together. in the years 1899 and 1900. As I mentioned, Lou Andrea Salome was born and raised in Russia. She was of German ancestry, but was of a military family and lived in Russia until she was 16. So it was, in effect, her homeland. And it soon became something of Rilke's own spiritual homeland, adopted as such, as a result of these two important journeys to Russia. And the work that I've referred to, the first great work of Rilke, is widely recognized as such, came directly out of that trip to Russia, and also the Italian trip is certainly present there as well. But the immediate trigger was the trip to Russia, especially the first one in 1899. And the work I'm referring to is the Book of Hours. And the Book of Hours manifestly reflects Lou's influence on the intellectual level as well as other levels. Because in fact, in the 1890s, Lou was very deeply invested in looking into the psychology of religion and wrote many essays on that subject. In fact, Karl Karenyi recognized her as the kind of founder of the discipline of the psychology of religion per se. Rilke imbibed many of her ideas, and maybe we'll have time to go into some of those at some point. That would be a session in itself. And what that did for him was enabled him to freely reimagine his relationship to God, to resuscitate his religiosity, but find an idiom that he felt was true to himself. Maybe one can abbreviate it by saying that Lou Salome gave Rilke license to create and reverence his own God image rather than some kind of established God figure, to create his own God in the lineaments of his own spiritual ideals and relate in dialogue to that figure. You could see why her psychological approach to religion could be so important in kind of resuscitating and giving a different theoretical ground for what remained of his powerful devotional feelings, which feelings before meeting were kind of at a loss for an object. And the Book of Hours is kind of a project of constructing the new God image in a way in accord with his own independent, deep feelings and thoughts, as is profoundly supported by the myth of Russia that is developed and comes through that work. To some degree, I think it's indubitable that the project of the Book of Hours, which is a tremendously spiritual and uplifting work, was sold many copies when it emerged, finally was published in 1905, and has, even to this day, over 100 years later, is one of the best-selling of Rilke's works. How many of you know the wonderful translation by Anita Barrows and Joanna Macy, right, which has, I think, made it accessible to an English-speaking audience. So I think it is indubitably the case that the uplift of the relationship with Lou had a great deal to do with the spiritual energy that one finds in the Book of Hours. And there's a certain, and this isn't meant in a critical sense, a sublimation of Rilke's love for Lou that enters into his relationship to God, his God image. And that's borne out by the fact that the one poem in the entire book, the Book of Hours, that was not written along with the others in response to the journeys to Russia, is a love poem that he wrote to Lou before their Russian journeys, addressed to Lou, But in the context of the Book of Hours, the you becomes God. And this is that poem. Extinguish my eyes, I'll go on seeing you. Seal my ears, I'll go on hearing you. And without feet I can make my way to you. Without a mouth I can swear your name. Break off my arms, I'll take hold of you with my heart as with a hand. Stop my heart, and my brain will start to beat. And if you consume my brain with fire, I'll feel you burn in every drop of my blood. Powerful stuff again. And there is a kind of calcinatio motif evident in this poem as well. But most of all, the poem exhibits another alchemical operation, namely the union of two distinct bodies that's named the conjunctio. And I think it's pretty manifest that Lu's quotation that I read earlier also exhibits this motif of the conjunctio, the coming together, the union. And she speaks about how it wasn't so much the union of two halves as the realization of a pre-existing marriage. But I think it's this motif, this alchemical motif of the conjunctio, that is most characteristic of the tenor and texture of the Book of Hours as a whole. The Book of Hours is actually really three books consisting of the first, the Book of Monastic Life, the second, the Book of Pilgrimage, and the third, the Book of Poverty and Death. But it's in that first one, written immediately after the first journey to Russia, that gives us the poetic persona that speaks all the poems. As the title of that book, the Book of Monastic Life, indicates, the poems are written in the persona of a monk, and not only a monk, but an artist monk, an icon painting monk. It's a Russian monk who is a painter of icons. And the very first poem, and by the way, many of the poems I'll be reciting, if you haven't figured that out already, are on the sheet, so you can follow along with me if you wish to while I read them. There are a couple exceptions, but most of the ones I'm quoting are on there. I'm going to read now the very first poem of the Book of Monastic Life, which gives us the persona of the monk who is the speaker of the books. The hour bows down and touches me with its clear metallic ring. And that, of course, is the hours. What he's referring to is the bell ringing that is calling to prayer at specific hours. The hour bows down and touches me with its clear metallic ring. My senses shiver. I feel, I can grasp the day as a malleable thing. Nothing was whole before I beheld it. All becoming stands still. My glances are ripe, and like a bride, to each comes the thing that it wills. Nothing's too small for me to love and paint great on a background of gold. I hold it high and know not whose soul it will break from the mold. I think in this poem as well, there are conjunctio motifs evident, although in a somewhat less dramatic fashion than the other sources we've mentioned. The very beginning of the poem, there's a kind of refiguration of the Annunciation archetype. Instead of the angel Gabriel descending and inseminating Mary, we have the hours, the spiritual tone of the bell coming into the poet, the monk, poet, painter, and inseminating him with creative power. And that itself is a kind of conjunctio of the divine and the human that's kind of seminal to the impulse of the whole rest of the poem. And then, of course, there's also the figure of the world, the things of the world coming like a bride to the glances, the creative vision of the poet. Also a moment of conjunction or union of this time the world and the soul. And I think it's fair to say that in general the impulse of the unity of the soul, the God and the created world as a whole is the primary impetus that underlies the Book of Hours, this exaltation and celebration of an underlying unity between God's self and world. I think you can perhaps get a flavor, still a further flavor of that in another poem, which is not on the sheet, that I'll read. That's later in the volume. None of these are titled, by the way. And you inherit, and the you here is of course God, the addressee of most of the poems. And you inherit the green of vanished gardens and the motionless blue of fallen skies. Dew of 1,000 dawns, countless summers the sun sang, and springtimes to break your heart like a young woman's letters. You inherit the autumns, folded like festive clothing in the memories of poets, and all the winters, like abandoned fields, bequeath you their quietness. And then it goes on in a great inventory of things of the world that God inherits through the medium of the poetic vision, and ends with this paragraph. Thus the overflow from things pours into you, just as a fountain's higher basins spill down like strands of loosened hair into the lowest vessel, so streams the fullness into you when things and thoughts cannot contain it. So the whole poem is a kind of a paean to this grand conjunctio between soul, God, and the universe, or the created world. I do want to emphasize, however, that if we think back to Lou's quotation about her relationship to Rilke, she mentions brother-sister love there, love between equals, and that was certainly part of the dynamic between Rilke and Lou. Otherwise, I don't think the romantic relationship could have thrived as it did for as long as it did. By the same token, Lou was 14 years older than he was. And there was also indubitably a mother-son dynamic that played into their relationship. And the problematic aspects of that dimension of the relationship, I think, are indicative of the fact that in the Book of Hours, I think we're really dealing primarily with what Edinger, in distinguishing between two species of the conjunctio, calls the lesser conjunctio, which in his description entails the fusion of substances not yet thoroughly separated. And one psychodynamic that he mentions as characteristic of this lesser conjunctio is, and I quote, the immature son ego embracing the maternal unconscious. And I think this archetypal dynamic underlies, and this isn't to devalue any of the artistry or accomplishment in the Book of Hours, but I think it is an archetypal dynamic that underlies much of the Book of Hours. And it does not do so by any means in only a negative guise. It's clear that Rilke was able to revive his relationship with God, or the God image, because the God of the Book of Hours has powerful feminine and maternal characteristics. It's no longer the patriarchal God, exclusively the patriarchal God of the traditional Judeo-Christian heritage. It was inspired by Russia, as in Mother Russia. And Rilke is very explicit that what drew him to Russia was a sense of dark, inexhaustible mystery that provided a complement to the light-filled creativity he had experienced in Italy. And these were part of a dialectic in his mind. Darkness associated powerfully with Russia, a divine darkness, a creative darkness, as opposed to the light vision of the Renaissance paintings. And this appears quite obviously in several of the poems in the Book of Hours. Let me read, for instance, the third poem right at the beginning of the cycle, which you have on the sheet, and which reads as follows. I have many brothers in the south who move, handsome in their vestments, through cloister gardens. The Madonnas they make are so human, and I dream often of their Titians, where God has become an ardent flame. Obvious reference to his Italian trip. But, when I lean over the chasm of myself, it seems my God is dark, and like a web, 100 roots silently drinking. This is the ferment I grow out of. More I don't know, because my branches rest in deep silence, stirred only by the wind. Then the next poem speaks to the same thing, and I'll go right on to read the 11th poem of this cycle, which explicitly expresses his love of the divine darkness. You, darkness, of whom I am born, I love you more than the flame that limits the world to the circle it illumines, excluding all the rest. But the dark embraces everything, shapes and shadows, creatures and me, people, nations, just as they are. It lets me imagine a great presence stirring beside me. I believe in the night. Edinger remarks that this mother-son embrace is by no means entirely negative or regressive or destructive, but can be, in his words, inseminating and rejuvenating. And I think that's clearly the case for Rilke, as is borne out by the very next poem, which certainly has motifs of insemination and rejuvenation. This is the 12th poem. I believe in all that has never yet been spoken. I want to free what waits within me, so that what no one has dared to wish for may for once spring clear without my conniving. If this is arrogant, God, forgive me, but this is what I need to say. May what I do flow from me like a river, no forcing and no holding back, the way it is with children. Then, in these swelling and ebbing currents, these deepening tides moving out, returning, I will sing you as no one ever has, streaming through widening channels into the open sea. So there's certainly rejuvenation. Let me get this up a little bit again. I'm getting lower and lower here. Okay. That's good. That's a little. So there's certainly rejuvenation evident in these wonderful poems. At the same time, the lesser conjunctio, because it is a joining of incompletely separated and impure elements, can, and characteristically does, also lead towards a destructive end, a kind of maiming or fragmenting, and ultimately an annihilation or death. Edinger writes, the lesser conjunctio is a union or fusion of substances that are not yet thoroughly separated or discriminated. It is always, he says, always, followed by death or mortificatio. Now, Rilke's life and work certainly bears this out, and in what way it does so will be the beginning of the next phase of the presentation. But I want to end this part of it here. Thank you. And I will be glad to take questions at this point from those in the room or the webinar on the material presented so far, after which we'll have a short break before we resume. But I hope there are some questions about what I've raised so far. So the floor is open. Yes, please.
Do you know to what degree he was influenced by Nietzsche?
As much as anybody knows that. He certainly read The Birth of Tragedy. There's a copy recovered with Rilke's Marginalia in it. And his, he wrote a kind of short story called The Apostle, which has some of the spirit of the Visions of Christ, but is in an almost even more Nietzschean, written in even more of a Nietzschean fury that certainly reveals, I think, a influence of Nietzsche. On the other hand, it's not the case that he also was in constant discussion with Lou Salome, who knew Nietzsche very, very well. They, of course, lived together in a famous trio at a certain point, and Lou had already written on Nietzsche. So I expect a lot of Rilke's Nietzsche came through Lou. At the same time, it would not do to overestimate Nietzsche's influence on Rilke. I don't think he read a hell of a lot of Nietzsche himself. He read some, and I think other influences were probably equally important. Ralph Waldo Emerson, for one, who he was reading at that time. And both Nietzsche and Emerson share this celebration of the individuality and a kind of breaking away from religious tradition. So I think Nietzsche was important to Rilke as one of many kind of influences, but I think that that he was not a dominant influence, and as Lou was. And one thing I didn't really get into is that Rilke criticism in general recognizes the inestimable importance of the human connection between Lou and Rilke for his psycho-spiritual development. At the same time, sometimes that overshadows the fact that she was an immense original intellectual influence on his work. The theology, if you will, in the book that's reflected in the Book of Hours, and it's not a theology, it's a poem, but there's an underlying understanding of the relation between soul and God. That, it is quite clear if you steep yourself in Lou Salome's essays on the psychology of religion and her ideas about the God image and the back effect, how in an image of God can be born by the human being and then takes on a certain independence, an objective psychic reality that is no longer entirely bound to that individual psyche, but takes on a kind of independent reality, and so has this kind of reciprocal back effect on the viewer, on the individual. Her ideas about the essence of the religious effect, which consists in her mind, she's got a brilliant discussion of this. I'll just paraphrase it. Not surrender of the self before some greater divinity, nor the champion of all the faculties of the individual, the celebration of the fullness of the human individual, but the friction between those two paradoxical influences is, according to Lou, what gives birth to the primordial religious sentiment. And you find the friction, and you find this very clearly manifest in the whole ethos that underlies Rilke's works, but you will not find in Rilke criticism, except mine, right here, you know. A whole chapter on Lou Salome. But generally speaking, and I've been to many Rilke conferences, you won't find, and this is a point that feminism could well take up, you won't find an appreciation of Lou's ideas, and they were absolutely vital to Rilke's development, much more so than Nietzsche, because they're much more pervasive, deep, and widespreading than the more generic impulses that he took from someone like Nietzsche. And I wish those essays on psychology of religion were published in English, but I don't think they are. And there's a new edition of Lou's work, which is coming out in German, which has just come out recently, which is wonderful. But I'm hoping, you know, in the, you know, near future, the rising appreciation of Lou Salome's importance as a thinker and not just a companion will bring to birth these very important texts in English. Other questions? Yes.
This one comes from one of our online viewers. Rilke changed his first name from Rene to Rainer. Do you have any insight to why he changed his name?
Yes. It all goes back, as most other things, to Lou Andreas Salome. She thought Rene was too effeminate, and she encouraged him to adopt the simple, dignified, masculine Rainier, or Rainer in its German equivalent. So I think symbolically that really speaks volumes. And that happened not too long after they originally met in 1897. That as a result of the relationship with Lou, Rilke acquired the name that he has since then been known as, you know, Rainer, rather than Rene, which was his mother's choice, you know, and certainly of a piece with the. There's a whole chapter of Rilke's psychology that you know, gives recognition to the fact that his mother had lost was stillborn, a daughter, you know, before Rilke was born, and he was raised in many respects as if he, on his mother's side, as if he were a girl. He had this alter ego called Sophie, and she would invite him in for tea, and relating to him as a little girl named Sophie, and dress him in girls' dresses and so forth. I understand that this was not so unusual at the time, but nonetheless, the degree to which that was a dynamic is important in his psychobiography. His father provided the opposite pole. He thought the only playthings appropriate for the young boy were dumbbells, and poetry was certainly not among the professions that his military father thought were a kind of respectable profession. And I can verify the fact that his father's opinion was the correct one, you know. But unless you're Rilke, who ultimately did quite well. And then there's a whole chapter of his life where he goes to the military school at his father's urging, and I'm sure many of you have read about the trauma that affected in his letters to a young poet and so forth. Yeah.
That actually leads into another question
Yes.
I have from our online audience. Rilke changed abruptly after he was forced through basic training during World War I. Is there any evidence as to what may have disturbed him during this time?
Well, I'd need to know a little bit more about what is meant by changed abruptly. He was conscripted in the middle years of the war, and it was devastating. It was a devastating experience. The questioner might know that he began his elegies in 1912, the famous Duino elegies, and didn't complete them until 10 years later, in 1922. And of course, the years intervening were primarily preoccupied by the war. And for much of that period, Rilke was effectively confined to Munich. He didn't like being in Germany for the most part. He didn't live most of his life in Germany. He lived in Paris, and he was peripatetic, lived all, of course, at the end of his life after the war. He lived the last 7 years of his life once he could leave Germany in Switzerland. But the trauma of being conscripted for a short period of time, and it was only the intervention of friends that got him out of it. I mean, can one imagine the 40-year-old Rainer Maria Rilke, it's just like nuts. But and it was very damaging. And he said that it really rent the continuity of inner meditation that was necessary for the continuation of its work. And there's no doubt that the intervention of the war, at the same time it contributed to the poignancy and urgency of some of the later elegies, was part of that hiatus, that lengthy hiatus that took place, that required 10 years for the completion of the work. And yeah, it's true that after the war he relocated to Switzerland and was able finally to finish the elegies there. Other questions? Yes, please. That's a good question. Are the visions of Christ available?
Can you please repeat the question?
Yes, the question is, are the visions of Christ available? And I presume you mean in English. Yes, they're not, I have a volume. Siegfried Mandl has a critical edition, which the translator was actually Aaron Kramer. I've got it in my bag. And you can try on Amazon. It's not widely available. It's not something that is been, I meant to look that up before I came because I was hoping that question would come up. So you might be able to get a copy. Tayo, do you have information about that? Uh-huh. Yeah. So you can probably get them. As I say, they're not, this edition I think came out in 1966 or something from the University Press. So they're not widely available, but if you try hard enough, you could probably land one. Yes? That's an interesting question. She also grew up in a household that was very religious, Christian. A certain brand of I don't know the technical term, but pietism. And I certainly recommend very strongly, I know that Lou's own memoirs are available, and I think it's called in English, Looking Back. One moment, let me see if I can. Anyway, look for Lou's memoirs, and she will tell something of the story of her own religious background and her transformation in that regard. She had a very, by her own account, a very, having grown up in this kind of environment, she had a very deeply religious upbringing, and as a child was deeply religious, and had a kind of, she says, an intuitive relationship to God, and a particular image of God. I don't remember what she called it, but the God with magic pockets or something, who could pull out whatever you wanted from those magic pockets. And then she relates how there was an incident that took place when she was still a young child, in which a question, a kind of riddle emerged about the identity of a couple of guests, not real guests, but imaginal guests. And she asked her dear friend, God, he was her best friend, for the answer to that riddle. And he couldn't come up with it. He couldn't come up with the answer. The answer was actually they were two snow people, two snowmen. And this, in her own account, this was devastating to her. And her own kind of intuitive, imaginal relationship to the God figure was never the same again, she said. And she could never worship the kind of rationalistic construction that came through of God, that came through the more official channels. So to her family's great dismay, I think on the day of, she refused to go to her confirmation at a young age, and forged her own path of spirituality through her very original thoughts and feelings on the subject. But she, like Rilke, had this very close relationship with a childhood God, which then died and had to be resuscitated in a way that was more, commensurate with her, independent beliefs. And of course, they're living at a time, the late 19th century, the early 20th century, when the traditional God image is losing sway, and there's a lot of outright rejection of religiosity. It's the Industrial Revolution and so forth. But neither Rilke nor Lou reject religion, and in this way they're very similar to Jung. They continue to see spirituality and even religiosity as the ground, creative ground of an authentic human life, and they resist the tendencies to dump out spirituality with outworn religious symbols, but both are dedicated to reviving it in a way that was authentic to the modern soul. Yes. Yes. That's after. And that is a kind of prose. It's a wonderful book. The question was about Rilke's prose collection, the Der Geschichten die lieben Gott, in German, translated as The Stories of God. It may appear under some other titles as well. It's often a trick in translations. They get different titles sometimes, but you can find it, I think, under The Stories of God. And this was a collection of short stories which were a kind of companion piece to the Book of Hours, the poetic effect of his trip to Russia, whereas The Stories of God are also very involved with the Russian settings. And there, it's the God that is addressed in those stories is the God of the Book of Hours, which is his own God image. And the introduction to that collection is by Rilke himself is quite wonderful. He gives the raison d'etre for writing the little collection and talks about how what he really wants to do, this relates to the question about Lou, in that book, is to tell stories of God to children, and tell it from there's a conceit that the storyteller, the speaker of that book, has secret information about the identity of God, really knows, but he's too shy to tell the children about that directly himself. So the speaker is a kind of mediator who's relating, all this secret information that this special knower has in an idiom appropriate to children. So it's a unique and wonderful way that, again, the impetus is to try and give a fresh experiential sense of divinity. And many of the stories are quite wonderful. Yes, another question. A good question. When he studied Russian with Lou before he went, and he did pick up quite a bit. this is kind of characteristic for him. Of course, he ultimately became fluent in French. In the last years of his life, he wrote more poetry in French than in German. When he got interested in the Quran, he picked up a little Arabic. And at this period, when he was very interested in Russia, he did study it intensely. He never became fluent. He did get enough command of the language to try his hand at some poems in Russian, which I understand are a little awkward in that respect, but he got that far. Nonetheless, it was certainly a handicap when he was traveling there, and it was part of his dependence upon Lou, who was fluent in Russia, having lived there till she was 16. And I'm sure many of you know what it's like to travel in a foreign country when you're not really comfortable in the language and your partner is. I mean, that on top of her being 14 years older and published and so forth, it was a little difficult to maintain the equivalence in the relationship. But I would also, well, leave that for future time. Any other questions presently from the webinar, or otherwise we can take about a 15-minute break and resume after that. Thank you very much. I did want to, before beginning the second presentation proper, I did want to add one more reflection about the comment about the question about Nietzsche's influence on Rilke. It occurs to me to mention that while there's certainly affinities between Rilke and Nietzsche in terms of their worldviews, there's a huge divide between them in many respects. And one of those respects is the relationship to women. Because I do think that, and it's almost symbolically manifested in their relationship to Lou Salome. Some of you may know that Nietzsche actually proposed to Lou Salome at a certain point, and she rejected the proposal, and he was pretty devastated by that. And it may not be unfair to say that there's a certain rather strong strain of misogynism in Nietzsche in general. And nothing could be further from the truth with Rilke. And the relationship to the feminine on every level is quite dramatically different in the two thinkers. And I think that's kind of important to keep in mind. All right, so let's continue. I had a request to do a little more German. I'm going to begin. You have any German speakers here? Oh, quite a few, great. So some of you will understand me. I'm going to begin with a poem titled Aus einem Wurpswederzyklus vom Tode. Geht vor mir, ich kann ihn immer sehen und bin doch bange, ihn zu überholen. Von seinen Schritten biegen sich die Bohlen und seine Schultern schließen die Alleen. Weiß den Weg, als wär das Land sein eigen. Die Kreuzwegpfähle mit den langen Händen scheinen sich von den Orten fortzuwenden und heimlich hinter ihm auf ihn zu zeigen. From a Wurpsweder cycle of death, he goes before me. I can see him always, yet still fear overtaking him someday. Bridge planks bend beneath his heavy steps, and his shoulders close the boulevard of trees. He knows the way as if the land were his, and the crossroad arrow hands, long, dark, slim, seem to turn away from all the proper places and secretly, from behind, point to him. So in the spring of 1900, Rilke and Lew took the second of their 2 Russian voyages, and this one was a much longer one than the first, and in many ways more satisfying. It included visits to Moscow to the aged seer Leo Tolstoy. There's great stories about the visits to Tolstoy when he let in Lou Salome, who was, of course, a Russian compatriot, and closed the door in in Rilke's face, not allowing him to enter. He was a crusty figure by that time. And they also had a 2,500-mile steamer trip on the Volga and Dnieper rivers through the Russian heartland. And as you might imagine, by the end of this monumental voyage, Rilke and Lew's relationships was a bit on the rocks. Lew especially was, I think, emotionally exhausted on account of certain dynamics of Rilke's emotional dependence upon her. We've kind of alluded to that before. And they both recognized a need for more separation. So upon the return from Russia, Lew returned to Berlin, which was her residence, and Rilke, at Lew's encouragement, accepted an invitation to spend some time at a small artist colony in the North German moors called Worpswede. And the poem that I just read is located there. It's from a Worpswede cycle. Now, Worpswede became the scene of the next very crucial phase in Rilke's life and work. One of the most important features of Worpswede, in addition to the very beautiful natural landscape. By the way, Worpswede is still a thriving place with many wonderful museums, and still a place for artists. I've been there twice. That honors its heritage with a relation with Rilke as well. So if any of you are ever in that part of the world, it's a really wonderful place to visit, and still, as I say, a thriving center for art. But one of its feature attractions is not only the beautiful landscape, but in Worpswede, Rilke met 2 young women who were not only women, but also artists. The painter Paula Becker, who was in time to become one of the most well-known German painters of the 20th century. She's has quite some repute to this day. And the young sculptress Clara Westhoff. Rilke was attracted to both of these young women, but he was also, in addition to the personal level of the relationship, he took a great deal from their focus on the visual, from their being visual artists. This, of course, the Worpswede was saturated. It was basically mostly landscape painters, had been founded by landscape painters. And although Clara was a sculptress, as I mentioned, and Paula was really not a landscape painter. She was more of a portraitist. But through Paula and Clara and their attention to visual detail, as well as that of the other artists there, Rilke really began to focus on the art of the concretely realized image, the embodied image, especially visually, even more than had been the case before. Certainly, he had been profoundly interested in icons. That was part of the aesthetic of the Book of Hours. But one could hardly imagine 2 idioms of painting that are more diverse than the Russian icon on the one hand, and the landscape art of the Worpswede artists on the other. You know, in Russian icons, if there's any nature at all, it's in the background and highly stylized. The attention is always focused on the saint or the Madonna. And nothing could be further from that in the tremendous attention to mood, atmosphere, naturalistic detail that Rilke experienced in Worpswede. And this very much influenced his art and helped him move from the kind of vast but generic relationship to nature that you see in the Book of Hours to much more concretely realized detail. Now, this was a kind of quite conscious development in Rilke's art and life. And he testifies to this initiative in a book from a poem written in Worpswede called Progress. Interestingly enough, which is on your sheet, and I'll read. Interesting enough, the original title of this poem was Gebet, which means prayer. He later changed it to Fortschritt, and you will see that it's not at all prayer-like, but this the fact that he could have initially named it prayer, and his original name of the whole Book of Hours was simply Gebete, or prayers. So this is kind of symbolic of the shift of his spiritual sensibility from being anchored in his own version of Russian spirituality to something that's much more profoundly influenced by landscape painting and a more direct, visually realized relationship to nature. So the poem reads as follows: Progress. And again my deep life rushes louder, as if there were broader banks it now flowed between. To me things become more intimately related, and all images more completely seen. Kin to what's nameless and without wishes, with my thought, as with birds, I reach from the oak into the windy heavens, and in the pond's broken off day, my feeling sinks as if it stood on fishes. So one thing one might notice about this poem, of course, is Rilke's own acknowledgement of this focus on the image and realizing it more intimately and particularly. And it's at this time, too, this is from the Book of Hours, that many of his poems, almost all of his poems, start having titles, instead of just being part of the Book of Monastic Life, and then there's 33 poems, none of which are titled. So you could see even in their naming, there's a particularization. But it's also worth noticing in this poem that the world is still integral, that there is a unity between heaven, as figured by the tree reaching into the heavens, and the thought reaching into the heavens, and earth, and the pond's broken off day. There's a unity, too, between his thinking and his feeling, the thought that flies with the birds in the upper stratosphere, and the feeling that's in the sinking into the unconscious on the fishes. There's this range, but it's all held together in a satisfying sense of integral unity, which also reflects the sense of well-being that he experienced in his first weeks at Worpswede. He felt very much at home there, and was very much enjoying the company of the artists, and the feeling was mutual. So it was initially a very moving and good time for him. However, the sense of unity and integrity and the connectedness of things reflected in the poem Progress soon disintegrated rather dramatically. And compare the tone of the poem Progress, which we just read, with the following poem, which is called Ernste Stunde, or Solemn Hour. Whoever weeps now anywhere in the world, weeps without reason in the world, weeps for me. Whoever laughs now anywhere in the night, laughs without reason in the night, laughs at me. Whoever walks now anywhere in the world, walks without reason in the world, walks toward me. Whoever dies now anywhere in the world, dies without reason in the world, looks at me. Pretty dramatic difference. So what led to this difference? Well, as a matter of fact, Solemn Hour was written shortly after Rilke's departure from Worpswede, 6 weeks after his arrival there. And it was a sudden and unexpected departure. As a matter of fact, just days before, Rilke had rented an apartment and had decided, and this is recorded in his journals, to stay there indefinitely, to stay on in Worpswede. And several days later, he left early in the morning without even saying goodbye to anyone. Now, why? No one knows exactly why, but the most plausible explanation is as follows. Paula Becker, who of the two sisters in white, as Rilke called them, because Paula and Clara, who were very close friends, well, were sometimes, if you called them the sisters in white, they would often dress in white dresses. Rilke was probably drawn even more to Paula, the painter, than to Clara, although his relationship with them both, you know, had been intimate, but I think it's evident, not sexual. They were, you know, fellow young artists. But he was drawn towards Paula, and Paula had actually been secretly engaged to Otto Modersohn, one of the founders of the colony, and a much older man. And it is thought that Rilke probably learned of this secret engagement and was really devastated by it, and that's the most plausible reason, really the only reason, as far as I know, that anyone could come up with why he would depart so suddenly after having decided to stay in this idyllic place. So when he leaves Worpswede, he enters into a very difficult period in his life. He goes back to live in Berlin, where Lou is. And the emotional cross currents at this point in his life are very difficult. Lou, for perhaps obvious reasons, never really approved of his relationships with Clara and Paula. She wasn't a great supporter of that relationship. At the same time, her relationship with Rilke remained very vexed. There was one point in time where Lou said, in dating from this period, "Oh, I would do anything if Reiner would just go away," you know. So he was having, Rilke was not having an easy time with Lou, and it's important to recognize that even though he had physically left Worpswede, he had by no means broken off contact with the artists there, including Paula and Clara. They maintained correspondence and visited on occasion. And understandably enough, Rilke's attention turned more towards Clara in the aftermath of learning about Paula's engagement. And he responded to that, as one would hopefully expect, in a very gracious way, congratulating her on it and so forth. But nonetheless, he was kind of emotionally in Worpswede still, but not there. On the other hand, he's in Berlin with Lou and having a terrible time with her, and she not approving of, you know, the continued relationship with the younger women. His pet projects for Russian translations and so forth are falling apart, and so the whole world. And remember, at this point, he's not the great poet Rainer Maria Rilke. He is unknown. He's quite impoverished, and so he's 25 years old. We all know the early 20s. You know, it's a terrible time, especially if you're a sensitive poet. You know, and you don't go kind of fly off into the tech world, and you know, so. So here's a poem, and it says it's beginning at this period that the kind of depth and weight and darkness that we often associate with Rilke starts becoming a constant feature of his work. Here, one poem that dates, a famous one that dates from this period, is called Klage, or Lament, the beginning of which reads as follows, and this isn't on your sheet because it's just a little bit of at the beginning. Oh, how everything is far away and long gone by. I believe the star from which I receive light has been dead for thousands of years. A startling image to begin a poem with. I mean, the stars are the traditional symbol of eternity, right, and spiritual presence. And so to imagine the stars as in the sky, most all of them, as being dead, is a potent symbol of kind of a spiritual death. And Rilke is even more explicit about his own internal state in a journal entry that dates from this time, which I will read. It is an infinite humiliation to enroll here the names of the last several days, but for just that reason I shall do so, and do so briefly. Well, it's not so brief, but if every death, like every life, has been allotted a certain portion of time, then days like the last one will have to be counted up and deducted from its sum. For they are days spent beneath the earth, days in dampness and decay, such stretches of hopelessness, such gaspings of soul. And should they once not come to an end, not cast away, not suddenly become untrue, if one had to name all this I, this unspeakably disconnected, helplessly isolated consciousness that, cut off from the voices of silence, falls into itself as into an empty well, as into the depths of a pool that contains stagnant water and animals gestating in muck. What is one then? It is so frighteningly easy to die in this state. It is dying itself. I think it's fairly clear that Rilke was going through a psychological death experience at this time, which alchemically is called a mortificatio, or alternatively a negredo, a kind of dark night of the soul, a psychological death. From a theoretical standpoint, that's not surprising. We already heard Edinger mention that the lesser conjunctio, which is the fusion of impure, not yet sufficiently separated substance, always leads to a death experience in its aftermath. And in the Rosarium Philosophorum, which is the book, of course, that Jung interpreted in his Psychology of Transference, the plate of the mortificatio, or death, follows upon the conjunctio. And in the Psychology of Transference, Jung comments upon, begins his commentary on the mortificatio with these words: King and queen, who of course appear in the alchemical plates, king and queen are dead and have melted into a single being with two heads. The feast of life is followed by the funeral threnody. Just as Gabricus dies after becoming united with his sister, and the son lover always comes to an early end after consummating the hieros gamos with the mother goddess. All of this is psychologically very pertinent to Rilke, I think, given what we've said already. I think you can see that. So, after the conjunctio oppositorum, death-like stillness reigns. When the opposites unite, all energy ceases. There is no more flow. The waterfall has plunged to its full depth in that torrent of nuptial joy and longing, Book of Hours. Now, only a stagnant pool remains, without wave or current. Rilke writes, stagnant water. Jung writes, a stagnant pool. It's striking that they use similar imagery to relate the image of the prima materia, the prime material, that's the kind of residue of the negredo, the dregs, right, that is the result of this mortificatio. Well, Rilke didn't just sit around being depressed. He took action so far as he could. As a matter of fact, it was rather dramatic and some would say rash action. That is, after Clara visited him in February of 1901, visited in his rooms, the two became lovers and were engaged. Rilke proposed to Clara, and she accepted, even though it was a surprise to both of them. She said afterward, "I could have sworn we were just friends." But the engagement was rather unexpected on more than one front. Lou, as one might imagine, was appalled by the turn of events. She did think it was a rash decision and tried to dissuade him from going forward with the marriage. She could not do so. But 10 days after she learned of it, she was traveling elsewhere. She sent a letter to Rilke in which she essentially broke off all relations with him, saying that for their mutual benefit, all relationship between them at this point must cease. Rilke was devastated by this, and he wrote this poetic response the day after. Let me also add that Lou said that in her letter that if any point he really came to desperate straits, she would be there for him. She actually feared that he was somewhat suicidal. So she did hold that out to him. I just want to mention that. But Rilke was devastated, and he wrote the following words the next day. "I stand in the darkness as though blinded, because my gaze no longer reaches you. To me, the day's mad turmoil is a curtain behind which you stand. I stare at it and wonder if it will rise, that curtain behind which my life lives, my life's substance, my life's bidding, and yet my death." So despite obstacles, Rilke getting scarlet fever and minor details like that, Rilke and Clara do persevere and marry in the spring of 1901 and set up a household in Westerwede, which is a little village essentially adjacent to Worpswede, so in the same area. Initially, matters seemed to go rather well between them. At the same time, the kind of disintegrative forces of the Negredo that were working in the depths of Rilke's soul were not by any means put to rest by the marriage. In Westerwede in the fall of 1901, Rilke actually wrote the second part of the Book of Hours, kind of hearkening back to that original inspiration that led to the first volume, the Book of Monastic Life. But in contrast to the great conjunctio that's celebrated in the first book, the beginning of the second book has poems that I think bear witness to the inner disintegration, fragmentation, and disorientation that follow upon the lesser conjunctio and are continued to work in Rilke's soul. Here's the beginning of the second poem of the second book. It's the one that's not on the sheet since it's just a fragment. "I am praying again, awesome one." Remember, this is in the persona still of the Russian monk. "I am praying again, awesome one. You hear me again as words from the depths of me rush toward you in the wind. I've been scattered in pieces, torn by conflict, mocked by laughter, washed down in drink. In alleyways, I sweep myself up out of garbage and broken glass. With my half mouth, I stammer you, you who are eternal in your symmetry. I lift to you my half hands in wordless beseeching, that I may find again the eyes with which I once beheld you." quite a different tone from the first poem of the book, the Book of Monastic Life, in which the artist monk is celebrating his creative power and his unity with the Godhead. And as a matter of fact, life at Vesterveda as a married couple was short-lived. Despite the fact that their child, Ruth, was born in December of 1901, or perhaps partly because of it. I mean, it can cut both ways. Rilke, in certain respects, was a very loving father initially, but he also was terribly annoyed by little Ruth's screaming. It was a very small house, and he found no quiet for his work. And then for many years, Rilke had been subsisting in large part upon a stipendium that his richer uncle Jaroslav had provided for his student years. And now that Rilke was married, that money was suddenly cut off. And that became a kind of trigger. It triggered financial distress for Rilke and became essentially an excuse for breaking up there were not just an artificial excuse, but a reason or a pretext for breaking up the household. So in 1902, Rilke moved to Paris. Ruth went to live with her maternal grandparents, the little child, and Clara was left kind of putting together the Vesterveda house before she too later moved on to Paris. So the brief experiment in marriage and householding was just that. Rilke was unfortunately really not suited for the role of husband or father, and it was perhaps better that he realized that sooner rather than later. I will mention that he and Clara remained married for the rest of Rilke's life. They did try, and there's many years in which Clara remains a very important person in a positive way in Rilke's life. They do ultimately try and get a divorce, but are not allowed to because nominally, at least from childhood, they're still members of the church, and the church won't sanction it. An interesting irony. At any rate, some of Rilke's most famous poems date from the period of his early weeks and months and years in Paris. It's a very difficult period because none of the underlying issues have really been resolved, the issues that I mentioned before, and there is added to all that difficulty that's still there on an emotional and practical level, the fact of Rilke confronting this huge foreign city, Paris. And we'll have more to say about that shortly, but for now I just want to recite the beginning of a couple of poems, share with you from that period that give the feeling texture of Rilke's Negretto, ongoing Negretto in Paris in 1902. The poem Autumn, which dates from that time, the beginning of it reads as follows. The leaves are falling, falling as if far away, as if distant gardens withered in the skies. They fall with gestures saying no. And in the nights the heavy earth falls from a multitude of stars into aloneness. This poem is one of many from that period that are steeped in this sense of existential isolation, a kind of dying or falling away from a lost wholeness or unity that reappears in so many of Rilke's poems. One more that I'll give in full and is on your sheet is another well-known one called The Neighbor, Der Nachbar. Do you follow me, strange violin? In how many cities have you run after me, your lonely nights speaking to mine? Do hundreds play you? Does only one? In all the big cities are there men and women who, without you, would have already flung themselves in the rivers. And why do I meet you again and again? Why am I always the neighbor of those who anxiously force you to sing and to say, life is heavier than the weight of all things? Very Rilkean, right? Well, that Rilkeanism dates from this Negredo period. In many ways, Rilke's Negredo can be regarded as the origin of his most mature work. And this, in a way, is true to alchemical form because the Negredo processes produce what can well be regarded as the prima materia of Rilke's work, the dark and even formless matter distilled from an engagement with death, with depression, and a kind of primal encounter with nothingness or non-being. The dark period around the turn of the century is a watershed that separates all that went before in Rilke's life, including the Book of Hours, from all, or the book, at least the Book of Monastic Life, because the later books of the Book of Hours include aspects of this. Certainly the Book of Poverty and Death, it's right there in the title. Anyway, what went before from all the work that comes after. And needless to say, despite the soul travail entailed by the Negredo, it's not at all a bad thing, or not all a bad thing. In an alchemical text that Jung cites provides a kind of larger perspective for how to regard, at least from the outside, what I'm sure from the inside is always just a devastating experience. That text reads, "When you see your matter going black, rejoice, for that is the beginning of the work." That beginning may, alchemically speaking, also be concretely imaged another way. Mortificatio is often associated with another alchemical process, the separatio. And we've already seen how, in a psychobiographical way, crucial separations from Lou, from Borpsveda, from Paula, and from Clara played a leading role in Rilke's Negredo and the psychological difficulties characteristic of this watershed in his life. But the separatio, like the mortificatio itself, is by no means merely negative, and also potentially is world creative. The end of one primal, perhaps an insufficiently differentiated union, may be the beginning of another world, the beginning of a new creation. And in fact, Edward Edinger writes about this motif as follows. In many cosmogonic myths, the first parents, Father Heaven and Mother Earth, for instance, first exist in a continuous embrace. They form, as it were, a hermaphroditic being in constant cohabitation. In this state, nothing can come into existence, because Father Heaven lies so closely on Mother Earth that there's no space for anything to grow between them. The first act of creation is therefore the separation of this divine couple, pushing them sufficiently apart so that a space is created for the rest of creation. One might think of the Egyptian mythology in which the sky god Nut and the earth god are in this embrace. Anyway, with that as a background, and please keep that motif very much in mind, listen to this poem dating from this period of time, Rilke's poem. It's a quite well-known one as well, Evening, which is on your sheet. Evening. The evening slowly changes the garments held for it by a row of ancient trees. You watch, and the realms divide from you, one traveling heavenward, one that falls, and leave you at home in neither one. Not quite so dark as the silent houses, and not so surely vowing the eternal as that which becomes star each night and rises, and leave you inexpressibly to unravel your life, fearful and immense and ripening, so that it, now bounded, now reaching infinitely far, becomes alternately stone in you and star. So Rilke's poem figures his own soul life as coming into new being in the space created by the separation, the pulling apart of heaven and earth, above and below, stone and star, the differentiation of the primal matter of the universe. And the idea image of this original and originating differentiation or separatio can be taken a step further. Edinger remarks that the primary act of separation is often described as a kind of a division, not only into two, but into four. For instance, into the quaternity of the four elements. Edinger cites Paracelsus, who states, "In the creation of the world, the first separation began with the four elements, when the first matter of the world was one chaos. From that chaos, God built the great world, separated into four distinct elements: fire, air, water, earth." I'd like to suggest that this primal separatio can be taken as a kind of prototype for what Rilke himself called the ripening of his life work. Specifically, I'd suggest that each of the four great works that comprise the main body of Rilke's mature opus can be provisionally identified in turn with one of each of those four elements. That his novel, his stream of consciousness novel, the Notebooks of Malte Loredz Brigge, can be associated with water, and that his Dinggedichte, the new poems that are thing poems, may be associated with earth, that the philosophical elegies can be associated with air, and that highly intuitive, spontaneously created sonnets could be associated with fire. And each of these elements naturally has an alchemical correlative. Solutio is associated with water, coagulatio with earth, air with the sublimatio, and calcinatio with fire, so that the itinerary of Rilke's mature opus can be read as reflecting dynamically the quaternity of these four fundamental alchemical processes. So what I'd like to do, the time remaining, is to review at least some of Rilke's mature works from this particular alchemical angle. And I think we may only have time for going through the Malta and the new poems. We'll see. But I want to emphasize that the interpretive framework I'm putting forward here shouldn't be taken too rigidly, that just as in alchemy, a certain process may go on simultaneously with others, that it's not just because I'm saying there's a deep association of the solutio with the Rilke's novel, that there aren't sublimatio processes taking place there as well. What I'm talking about is an emphasis and a dominance. But this ambiguity also certainly pertains to the order of the works. Rilke's novel, the Notebooks of Malte Brigge, and his new poems were worked on concurrently. Both date from his early days in Paris, and there's good reason why one could treat one or the other first. And in my book, I treated the new poems first, but here for alchemical reasons, which I think may become clear, I want to start this alchemical review of Rilke's major works with Rilke's only major novel, The Notebooks of Malte Loredz Brigge. And the novel begins as follows. So then, people do come here in order to live. I would have sooner thought one died here. I have been out. I saw hospitals. I saw a man who swayed and sank to the ground. People gathered round him, so I was spared the rest. The street began to smell from all sides. A smell, as far as one could distinguish, of iodine, of the grease of pommes frites, of fear. Thus begins the notebooks of Malta Lourdes Brigge. Though the idea of Malta was formally conceived in 1904, the novel's conception clearly dates from Rilke's earliest days in Paris, and letters from those earliest days often appear, sometimes almost verbatim, in the novel itself. And it's not by any means a traditional plot-driven novel, but is distinctly modern in form and character. As the title indicates, it's presented in the form of a journal or a notebook made up of discrete entries. It's a kind of almost Proustian work in which Malta, a young and psychologically afflicted Danish poet living in Paris, weaves together recollections of his Danish childhood, evocations of his environment in Paris, and reflections on history, literature, and religion. And true to the psychobiographical moment of its conception, the Negredo, which I've identified as a crucial watershed in Rilke's work, pervades the book. You can certainly tell that from the famous first line, "So then people do come here in order to live. I would have sooner thought one died here." What more one must say? The setting of the book is the young Dane, Malta, who has just moved to Paris, and his experience of the city is defined by a pervasive sense of disorientation, of death, of decay, and that experience of the urban environment, of the overwhelming large city, is not by any means exclusively limited to Malta's outer world. It's, of course, obviously reflective of his inner psychic state as well. And the second entry explicitly reveals how the sights and sounds of the city aren't limited in their reach to outdoor public spaces, but overrunning any boundaries that might delimit them, invade Malta's interior space as well. And here's the second journal entry. "To think I cannot give up sleeping with the window open. Electric streetcars rage ringing through my room. Automobiles run their way over me. A door slams. Somewhere a window pane falls clattering. I hear its big splinters laugh, its little ones snicker. Then suddenly a dull muffled noise from the other side within the house. Someone's climbing the stairs, coming incessantly, is there for a long time, then passes by. And again the street. A girl screams, 'Ah, tasse-toi, je ne veux plus.' Oh, quiet, or shut up. I don't want or can't stand anymore." The girl's scream expresses Malta's own sense of drowning in a sea of sight and sound he can't stop from washing over him or running over him. The sense of his own individual consciousness being occluded, absorbed, and erased in a field of nameless force finds further expression in another early entry in Malta's notebooks, one that picks up on motifs sounded in the opening passage. And of course, here it's quite telling that the Hotel Dieu that Rilke refers to is not a hotel at all, but a hospital. And I'm sure most of you know what Dieu means in French. "I am afraid. One has to take action against fear once one has it. It would be very nasty to fall ill here, and if it occurred anyone to get me into the Hotel Dieu, I should certainly die there. This excellent hotel is very ancient. Even in King Clovis's time, people died in it in a number of beds. Now they're dying there in 559 beds. Factory-like, of course." Malta has a great sense of humor. Factory-like, of course. It's one of the sides of Rilke people are sometimes not so aware of, this droll irony. Factory-like, of course, where production is so enormous and individual death is not so nicely carried out. But then that doesn't matter. The wish to have a death of one's own is growing ever rarer. A while yet, and it will be just as rare as a life of one's own. And so in Malta's Paris universe, the huge Hotel Dieu, or God Hotel, is a cavernous hospital that doesn't really heal or treat people as much as it does absorb and nullify their identity, which is kind of a metaphor for the city itself. In fact, everywhere Malta turns in the big infernal city, his individual consciousness is overwhelmed and seemingly threatened with extinction. But to understand the sense and meaning of what's going on in Paris for Malta, it's necessary to understand something of the place from which he came, his Danish, the scene of his Danish childhood, because that provides the psychological background against which the Paris experience takes meaning. So Malta grew up on an old estate called Ulsgaard, where he lived not only with his mother and father, but also his paternal grandparents. In fact, up till the time of her death, Malta's grandmother, Marguerite Brigge, was the totemic head of the household. And her character is kind of indicative of the prevailing atmosphere in that place. And Malta introduces her in these words, again droll. Mrs. Marguerite Brigge had always been, as far as my recollection of her goes, a tall, unapproachable old lady. She lived her life in our midst without consideration for anyone. She wasn't given to good deeds. She didn't like children, and animals weren't allowed to come near her. I do not know whether there was anything else she did like. And her personal foibles coordinate with that character. She had a phobic hatred of wine stains on the white tablecloth in the dining room, and any kind of sign of illness or injury was anathema to her. When a cook cuts her finger and puts some iodine on it, she claims the whole house smells and wants to dismiss the servant immediately and finally. And when Malta's mother gets sick, she sequesters, Malta's grandmother, Countess Brigge, sequesters herself in another part of the house and basically disappears and won't have any contact with the rest of the household. And Malta's father was a lot more correct and courteous than his mother, but he's only marginally less cold. His character is indicated by an episode in which Malta falls sick, gets sick when his mother and father are away at a ball. And the parents are called back, and Malta calms down quickly in his mother's arm, but his father doesn't respond in a very kindly fashion. He has a high fever, I heard Maman say timidly, and my father took my hand and counted my pulse. He wore the uniform of the master of the hunt with its lovely, broad, watered blue ribbon of the Order of the Elephant. What nonsense to send for us, he said, speaking into the room without looking at me. And in Malta's notebooks, that uniform, the perfect formality of the badge of the Order of the Elephant, is which is kind of a badge of mastery or control, stands as a symbol for the man himself. So I think I've said enough that you can get a sense of the dominant tenor of Ulsgaard. It's a kind of cold, rationalistic place where everything is subject to order and control, and all signs of illness are suppressed. And there's no doubt in terms of the order of power between the mother and the father. And in fact, Malta's mother does become sick and dies and mentally unstable and dies at a relatively early age. So against that background, the general character of Malta's Paris experience can perhaps be better imagined. For if, as we've kind of already discussed, that experience in Paris is one in which boundaries are not so rigidly controlled, one in which death and decrepitude and illness and decay, and in fact all these unconscious forces of body and soul are on full display and defining the nature of the circumambient world as well as Malta's psyche, well, you can see how that kind of environment might be a kind of psychic compensation for the rigid separation of conscious and unconscious, that he experienced in Denmark. And here I'm going to quote my book to give just a fuller sense of the character of Malta's experience in Paris. Here in Paris, Malta's everyday reality continually dissolves into a kind of spectral waking dream or nightmare. People dressed in hospital gowns float by in the window like ghosts. Men and women faint in the streets or die before your very eyes at the next table in the cafe. Epileptics dance on bridges, while blind men shout in the boulevards. Grotesquely bandaged inhuman forms sit next to you in the public clinic, and everywhere and nowhere are the poor and homeless, the outcast class who, with strange incomprehensible signs, beckon Malta, claiming him as one of their own. So what's going on then, alchemically speaking, in Paris? Certainly the Negredo or Mortificatio we've spoken about is still in effect, but there's another accompanying dynamic at work as well. Edinger writes, for the alchemist, solutio means the return of differentiated matter to its original undifferentiated state, that is, to prima materia. The fixed static aspects of the personality allow for no change. Think of that badge of the Order of the Elephants, the fixed static personality of his grandmother and father. That allows for no change. They're established and sure of their rightness. For transformation to proceed, these fixed aspects must first be dissolved. And a bit further on, we have here a picture of a descent into the unconscious, which is the maternal womb from which the ego is born. Edinger is quite clear on the point that this immersion into the unconscious can be experienced negatively as a kind of annihilation of consciousness and identity, but it's also ultimately positive as a process of rejuvenation or rebirth, and both aspects are quite evidently present in Malta. Admittedly, the negative aspect of it is by far the most dominant. For instance, there are numerous images of the dissolution of physical structure and its return to a putrid, amorphous substance, as in Malta's description of the fluid smells adhering to a half-demolished wall in a gutted house in Paris. There stood the tang of urine and the burn of soot and the gray reek of potatoes and the heavy, smooth stench of aging grease. To these was added much that had come from below, from the abyss of the street, which reeked, and more that had oozed down from above with the rain, and much more, the source of which one did not know. How could you have a better kind of evocation of the prima materia than that description of the gutted wall in Paris? And if there's any doubt that that wall was not just outside, but was also inside, the passage continues. I said, did I not, that all the walls had been demolished except the last. It is of this wall I have been speaking. One would think I'd stood a long time before it, but I'm willing to swear that I began to run as soon as I'd recognized that wall. For that is the terrible thing, that I did recognize it. I recognize everything here, and that is why it goes right into me. It's at home in me. Of course, the same is true for the man in the cafe whom Malta imagines, and we don't know if it's true or not, that he's dying on the spot. The man for whom, after a moment more, everything will have lost its meaning. That table and the cup, the chair to which he clings, will have become unintelligible, strange, and heavy. Naturally, this reduction of matter to its primordial form And this reduction of consciousness to a kind of nothingness, to a sea of senselessness, and this dissolution of identity terrifies Malta. At the same time, there's a part of him that does recognize that this dissolution of the structures of consciousness and this kind of extinction of the ego is also the prelude of a release into a larger reality, a reality that might be capacious enough to hold, as his Danish estate Ulsgaard certainly did not, both poles of the universe, the poor as well as the rich, the dark as well as the light, and suffering as well as joy. Edinger writes, "Solutio may become a mortificatio. That which is being dissolved will experience the solutio as an annihilation of itself. However, solutio leads on to the emergence of a rejuvenated form, and when this aspect is emphasized, the tone is positive. The golden treatise of Hermes, for example, asserts, when, by the power of the water, the composition is dissolved, it is the day of restoration. Then darkness and death fly away from them, and wisdom proceeds." Those motives are reflected in a passage from Malta in which healing water appears both in the form of tears and finally in a culminating image of the sea. Malta writes, "I'm attempting to write you. I think I must, because I've seen the saint in the Pantheon, the solitary, saintly woman, and the sleeping city beyond, and the river, and the moonlit distance. The saint watches over the sleeping city. I wept, because it was all so suddenly, unexpectedly there. I wept as I looked. I couldn't help myself. I am in Paris. It is a great city, great and full of temptations. As concerns myself, I must admit that I have in certain respects succumbed to them, and this has brought about certain changes. An entirely different conception of all things has developed in me under these influences. A world transformed, a new life filled with new meanings. For the moment, I find it a little hard because everything is too new. I am a beginner in my own circumstances. Wouldn't it be possible for once to get a glimpse of the sea?" Edinger indicates that the disintegration of the ego or egoic structure entailed in the solutio brings about an awareness of a need for a relation to the transpersonal, for a relation to a true self that is more generous than that of the limited rational consciousness. And I think it's clear that that saintly woman represents a higher transpersonal consciousness. And the repeated moments of dissolution of egoic consciousness in Malta are clearly part of Malta's and Rilke's long spiritual path. And indeed, in Rilke's case, are clearly preparatory for his relationship to the angel, the herald of the divine that inspired his great work, the renowned Duino Elegies, which was first conceived in 1912, just 2 years after Malta's completion. So, given the time, what I'd like to do now, I do want to talk a little bit about the new poems, but it's getting on towards 12:30. So what I want to do is I want to just take any questions about what I've presented so far in the second section, and let any webinar people who need to leave at 12:30 to do so. And then after that, I'll talk a little bit about the new poems and bring the whole thing to conclusion, and we'll take any further questions. So the questions for now try and, since we have it's kind of a brief time, restrict them to Malta or things that I've spoken of just in this second section. And if there are remaining larger questions, which I hope there will be, we can take those up later. Any questions about Rilke's Modificatio, the Negredo, the time at Worpswede, early Paris, or what I've said about Malta? I think it's fairly transparent how the Negredo experience in those Parisian days becomes part of this solutio, this dissolution of consciousness, that nonetheless provides a kind of new starting point for him. And I think it's also important to be aware of the fact that the very telling of his story in Malta, the re-envisioning of his own personal history in the guise of this fictional character, is a kind of dissolving of psychological configurations in the consciousness of the imaginal retelling. And that's an important part of the solutio that's going on here, the memory, the act of memory itself, the act of remembering, so that events, for example, his own relationship to his mother, which might have a certain rigidity and fixity in historical fact, are remembered, revised, reimagined, and given so that the self is given a new place to dwell in the storytelling experience. And there's no doubt in my mind that Rilke would have been entirely incapable of entertaining the relationship to the numinous power of the angel or those forces that enter into his later work without this healing fiction that took so much of his energy in from 1900 to 1910. So, yes.
Would you consider, rather than dissolving,
Mm-hmm.
would you consider that maybe this work of Malta is a great, act of integrating all the traumas that he's had within his family and these things? This is really where, at this point in his life, through this writing, a greater sense of integration is occurring?
Well, I think it's both. There's a simultaneity. I think there's a dissolution of, as I said, certain kind of fixation on facts of experience, and there's a taking of the energy that's vested in those, and a kind of reintegration of that. But I think it's important to keep in mind that Malta doesn't come out in flying colors at the end of the book. This isn't a romantic Bildungsroman where we have a triumphal development of the character. In fact, it's a question in the book whether Malta doesn't finally go under. What is it? It doesn't go mad. So it really is touch and go. So there is pictured, on the level of the book itself, there's many beautiful passages in relationship to ideas and so forth, but there is a process of disintegration that is actively played out, pathologized. I mean, he's ill, and you're not quite as conscious of that fact because you're experiencing the whole world through his prose. So that's the world you're seeing. But there's moments where oh my God, this is crazy, Malta's experience of it, and it is. So there is certainly played out a kind of solutio. There's other stuff going on, and also the relationship between Rilke as one has to be very careful and conscious about this. The relationship between Rilke as an individual soul and his fictional alter ego, Malta. He's doing things with Malta that places going with Malta that he doesn't want to go himself, right? That's why he's writing Malta. He can allow Malta to go bad and to maybe die and so forth, so that he doesn't have to. He said in the aftermath of publication of Malta, too many people identify me with my character. Malta's a fiction. You know, there are strong autobiographical resonances, no doubt about it. There's only one of the journal entries that is given place and time, and that's the first one, and it's September 11th, Rue Tuileries, and that was the place, the address that Rilke first lived in Paris. You know, so the autobiographical resonance is certainly there, but there's a transformation through the art of this. I'm using Hillman's term. There's a healing fiction, you know, that is represented by this work. Yes.
I wanted to go back to what you said, that Lou wrote to him when she broke it off, that if you ever
Right.
meet me, I'll be there.
Yes.
And when he's going through this terrible time in Paris, you know, he's broken off.
Yes.
She's broken it off.
Yeah.
He's lost his marriage.
Yeah.
Does he ever reach out?
He does. I think, I'm not entirely sure about the dates, but I think it's in 1905, so it's several years after the initial break where he does reach out to her, and they reforge their friendship in a quite wonderful way, and they remain close friends for the rest of Rilke's life. As I said, Lou outlived him, and she becomes a great support to him, and he becomes very important to her. In fact, as many of you may know, Lou becomes a confidant and colleague of Freud eventually. Rilke asks her not so long, well, that's part of the next section, but at one point he considers going to psychoanalysis himself after finishing Malta, which he said was a kind of self-treatment, and she discourages him from doing so. So they were, but she, you know, in terms of influence the other way, Lou Salome often said that she took a great deal of her inspiration and knowledge for her psychoanalytic career from her relationship to Rilke, that he was her, you know, she learned a lot of what she learned from psychology through the intimacy and constant conversation with this remarkable psyche. So they remained very important to each other for the rest of their lives, although they never lived, you know, together or were romantically involved. Again, the relationship shifted. Yeah.
It also seems to me that this Negredo
Yes.
was an internal death of the predominance of the mother and a shift to a woman of his own age. That there was something about the anonymous
Yes.
that had to come out.
Yes.
And then it came out in the writing.
Yes. I think that's true, and it's actually very interesting to think about, because there were women behind many of Rilke's great works. Lou, yes, I think partly a lover, but as you're implying, his mother figure is behind the Book of Hours. And then the elegies, the energy for the elegies, I mean, there's much that goes into that great work, but it's quite clear that his relationship with the artist Balladina Klazowska was absolutely instrumental to the completion of his elegies, and that was a much more mature love relationship of equals, and not at all a mother-son kind of thing. So it had transformed on that level. And then the last great work, the Sonnets to Orpheus, was inspired, you know, in the image world by his knowledge of a young girl who died when she was 19. You know, so there's at an archetypal level, the image of the anima was, you know, epitomized in Vera Ukama Knup's destiny. So there's a transformation in the archetypes of the feminine that are behind the great works, and so I think you're right on that score. Yes. Oh, that's a good question. So she was raised by her paternal grandparents. Rilke and Clara did continue to see each other and reconvene with Ruth for many years around Christmas, so he wasn't a totally absent father. she, totally, totally. He didn't, you know, and you know, for her part, she ultimately became the executor of his estate and very committed to his legacy. You can take that whichever way you want, but you know, you can see in his letters there's different phases of their relationship, and it is a relationship of you know, at some distance, obviously, but he was obviously a very important figure in her life. She married, and you know, and went on. Yeah. Yes.
In most of those figures, all the squalor, you know, the urban, the poverty, desperation, but Malti himself, he's a nobleman. I mean, his alter ego is he not a aristocratic?
No, he dreams about that. I think he has, you know, like generations back, but he's not in Paris as an aristocrat by any means. But in a quite sumptuous estate. I don't know if it was a castle. So that, yeah, there is a kind of, I don't know, high class background there. So that's true. In Paris, he's almost destitute, you know. So that's part of the polarities that are being played out. And with Malta, as with Rilke, there is this relationship to the nobility. I mean, Rilke was part of the generation in which the old European nobility, you know, before the war, was the last generation in which they exercised influence and sway, and as they had for, you know, for such a long time. In his relationship to another woman, Marie from Texas, and you know, I don't even, not going to, Princess Marie from Texas and Torn, Texas, Hohenlohe or whatever, who was the patroness of Duino Castle, provided emotional, material, and spiritual circumstances also which were indispensable to the elegies. It was her castle where Rilke finally conceived the first lines of the elegies, and the book is dedicated to her. So Rilke's own relationship to that, the old nobility, and to castles. You might be thinking about Duino Castle when you're, you know, thinking about Malta. I think of Hamlet's castle. There's interesting relationships between, you know, Elsinore and Malta. What the famous line, thinking about Ulsgaard and Malta's experience of his Danish past, you know, a line from Hamlet always rings out in my mind. And anyone know what that line is? Denmark is a prison, you know, and that's very much how I think Malta's psyche experienced that. Yeah. Any questions from? Okay. So I think what I want to do is just continue on. Any of the webinar participants who have had to leave us, I bid them adieu, and we'll continue a little bit. I want to say some things about the new poems, and then the time remaining, we'll open up to any other more general questions. So, as Malta makes evident, you know, Paris was really the scene of the darkest days in Rilke's life, but they were also the setting of creative developments that led him onward. And we really haven't addressed the question of how Rilke came to go to Paris in the first place. Now, the reason that he went there is because he was commissioned to write a monograph on an artist. Does anyone have a guess who that artist was? Auguste Rodin, the sculptor. And as a matter of fact, there were two really great teachers in Rilke's life. The first, and indubitably most important one, was Andreas Salome. And the second great master figure was the sculptor Auguste Rodin. in the course of working on that monograph on Rodin, Rilke had many interviews with the sculptor, and they actually became quite close, so close that Rilke was employed as Rodin's secretary for a time, living in the Hotel Biron, which was the Rodin, essentially Rodin's Paris studio, and which you can, to this day, is the Musée Rodin. Has anyone been there to the Rodin Museum in Paris? Yes, so that's, Rilke was living in the quarters there. And during the time of his, if you will, apprenticeship with Rodin, Rilke moved forward with the initiatives that were already set in motion in Worpsstede in terms of seeing and focus on visual detail and focus on physical texture and concrete image. Because Rodin was, as you all know, a sculptor. So his medium was not paint and the illusion of painting, but stone, which is, of course, just about the most concrete form of matter one can imagine. And this was very significant for Rilke. In his book on Rodin, Rilke writes about the attraction, the unique attraction that sculpture carries. And he writes as follows: "Fearful of the invisible tribunals of an oppressive faith, men had sought refuge in these." He's talking about the sculpture specifically that often appears in medieval cathedrals, the figures that often, gargoyles and all the different figures that often adorn the medieval cathedrals. So fearful of the invisible tribunals of an oppressive faith, men had sought refuge in these visible forms, had escaped from the unknown to this concrete embodiment. This was a better way than by painting, for painting was also an illusion. They desired something more real, something simple. So visible form, concrete embodiment, something more real, all these phrases testify to the patent connection between sculpture, and especially stone sculpture, and the process of solidification that's alchemically identified with the process of coagulatio, coagulation. And in fact, there's an alchemical dictum that's often repeated, which goes as follows: dissolve and coagulate. And that is sometimes presented as a kind of summation of the essence of the whole alchemical process, a dissolution on the one hand and a coagulation on the other. And so that even as Rilke's alter ego, Malta, was suffering this kind of dissolution of consciousness in Paris, the poet was simultaneously constructing new, kind of more solid structures of poetic consciousness in his life and his art through his involvement with Rodin and the developments of his poetry that it inspired. Edinger describes the essential character of the coagulatio in these terms. Coagulatio is the process that turns something into earth. Earth is thus one of the synonyms for the coagulatio. It is heavy and permanent, a fixed position and shape. It doesn't disappear into the air by volatilizing, nor pliantly adapt itself to the shape of any container, as does water. Form and location are fixed. Thus, for a psychic content to become earth means that it has been concretized in a particular localized form. So all those attributes, heaviness, permanent, fixity, are epitomized by stone. And I think it's fair to say that, and what transpires remarkably in the time period of Rilke's association with Rodin is that Rilke really adapts the aesthetic of Rodin's sculpture to the art of poetry. It's an amazing translation Because I think it's fair to say that in terms of raw artistry, Rodin may have been the greatest formal influence on Rilke. And to think of a sculptor being the master of a poet is quite marvelous. And I think in terms also of this process of coagulatio, of coagulation, what Rilke did in his poetry exemplifies that or embodies that even more powerfully than actual stone sculpture, because in stone sculpture you're beginning with a solid form, right? And you're chiseling out a shape from it. What Rilke did with his poetry was to endow the fluid, malleable character of language, which is not solid, with what came to kind of manifest or exhibit itself as a kind of solid thing-like shape, form, and quality, and an amazing kind of artistry. But how, in fact, did Rilke create poems that can be likened to sculptural forms? Well, let's look at one, and let's look at one of his most famous ones, which was also, interestingly enough, the very first new poem that Rilke wrote, and that is The Panther. How many of you are familiar with this poem? Good. You probably won't have heard it in this translation since it's mine, unless you raided my desk drawer. The Panther in the Jardin des Plantes, Paris. The passing of the bars fatigues his gaze so much that it can hold no more. To him, it is as if each bar were a maze that led to another and another barred door. The quiet pacing of the strong and supple limbs that turn around the very smallest sphere is like a dance of power around the rims of circles that hold a great will numb in there. Only seldom does the pupil's curtain slide soundlessly up. Then an image enters, ripples through the tensely stilled stride, and ceases where the rhythm centers. Before embarking on the new poems, Rilke said he was tired of writing poems about feelings. He wanted to make things out of feelings. And I think if you think back to the poems from the Book of Hours we read, which are gorgeous poems, but they're not formed in the way this one is. This represents an object in space and time, an animate object, but it has a thing-like quality. And in fact, Rilke's new poems are famous for inaugurating a new genre of poetry called Dinggedichte, which means thing poem or poems of things. And these things appear as independent freestanding objects in poetic space. And if any of you are familiar with the new criticism, you know, the history of what's called a new criticism in a literary context, this is kind of their gravy. They like to address a poem as a self-enclosed textual form that is a thing unto itself. And Rilke kind of anticipates that development in the Dinggedichte characteristic of the new poems. Well, how does he do this? How does he make poems that are things? We won't really have time to go into that in great depth here. It's very complicated, but on a purely technical level, I'll mention one thing, is that there's a great deal of strong enjambment in these poems. Does anyone know what that means technically? Yes. It means that the line that is borne along by the thought does not end at the end of the line, but there's a breaking of the thought. Called, like, the passing of the bars fatigues his gaze so much. If you looked back, for example, at the poem Evening we had read, the content of the thought ends at the ends of the lines, and that gives a kind of ideal quality to the feeling of the poem. Whereas if the sense of the line goes over the line break, to him it is as if each bar were a maze that led to another and another barred door. Only seldom does the pupil's curtain slide soundlessly up. This enjambment tends to give a material quality to the linguistic object. It's also very important that, well, where's the lyric I in this poem? Where is the I or the you? There isn't any, right? So there's a kind of elision of the lyric I in favor of a exclusive focus on the object and realization of the object. Now that raises a kind of interesting question, a conundrum of the subject-object relationship in relationship to the new poems, because in a way there's a separating of the subject out from the object world. Now you can look at that as a kind of elision of the subject, or you can look at it as a separation that allows for a more concrete, detailed, particularized realization of the object that ultimately allows a more differentiated relation of a subject to the object. It's maybe has some kinship with object relations therapy. So instead of the subject effusing its feelings through the generic objective world, as in the Book of Hours, there are particularly realized objects which reflect very specific states of mind, because the objects, the things that Rilke writes about, do not remain as merely kind of objective contents without psychic character. The panther is a powerful psychic constellation, right? So powerful that, how many of you saw the film Awakenings? Yes, then you'll remember that there's a mental patient in that film, the main character, who is in a paralyzed state. And the way he comes out of that is through identifying with Rilke's panther, because he finds his own psychic state so potently mirrored in that poem that it gives him a vehicle of articulating and bringing that to consciousness and moving out of that state. So there is this interesting fact that in a way the object poems, the Dinggedichte, while on the one hand not foregrounding self-consciousness, may actually be part of the development of a more differentiated subjective consciousness. And I think that speaks to the perhaps paradox that Rilke, even as he's writing these poems that formally at least elide the I, is under Rodin's tutelage himself actually solidifying his own poetic identity. Because I've talked a great deal about kind of the wasteland that Rilke found himself in. Well, it was through, in large part, this work with Rodin and the model, both humanly and artistically, of the master, that he kind of came to a much regained a sense of his own artistic vocation and his own egoic identity, his own more mature self. And this was another very important aspect of Rodin's influence, was not only in the technical level, but a kind of the level of the relationship to work. Rodin was an indefatigable worker. I mean, he's Pan, right? He creates just these incredibly prolific artists. And his motto was toujours travailler, always work. And Rilke adapted that motto as his own. Previous to this time, he had been a little bit of a prisoner of his own inspiration. He would write poems in bursts, many at a time, and then there would be long fallow periods. And as part of this coagulation, this solidifying of his identity, as encouraged by Rodin, he related to his poetry much more as a craft to work at willfully. Rodin said you should make a list of objects to write about, which he dutifully did, and then go write about those objects, bad, good, or indifferent, And the Panther, this wonderful poem came out of that project. Rilke, and this I think relates to another aspect of the coagulatio. As Edinger notes that the coagulatio is often associated with action, especially repetitive action, as in the constant churning motion that coagulates butter out of cream. You know, you stir something long enough and it turns solid. And he notes that willed activity, you know, in the beginning was the deed, said Faust, you know, promotes a kind of positive ego development. You know who you are through that repetitive action, and it's a kind of solidification of the personality. And there's, no doubt, as I mentioned, that Rilke's relationship to Rodin involved that kind of willed activity, which helped coagulate his identity. In the course of a few short years, he wrote almost 200 of these new poems. So there's a prolific, activity as part of what's going on here. In connection with this, another remark of Edinger's might be helpful in understanding the apparent paradox of Rilke solidifying his own identity while he's writing poems that typically elide reference to the I. Edinger observes that the spirit Mercurius represents the transpersonal self, and that to subject the spirit Mercurius to coagulatio means nothing less than the connecting of the ego with the self, which is the chief aim of individuation. So while the coagulatio enacted in the new poems may place Rilke's personal self or ego in the background, I think it's fair to say that the spiritual development or psychic development they embody represents a crucial phase of Rilke's ripening. Remember that word from the poem Evening. It's a deepening of his relationship with archetypal and transpersonal sources of being, with a self that is not so much a delimited I or ego, but is more congruent with the soul of the world that finds expression in all these wonderful variegated forms of things, of objects in the world. So I want to end this discussion of the coagulation in Rilke's new poems with one more very important fundamental idea and just one more poem, and then leave time for questions. Edinger cites alchemical texts, which in turn draw substantially upon Plato's Timaeus, to indicate that there's a profound connection between coagulation and the process of remarking likenesses between things. That is, the act of perceiving and expressing analogies. And Edinger writes, in essence, and here he's kind of paraphrasing what comes down from Plato and all these sources. In essence, and if any of you are familiar with Neoplatonism, you will know that it's a vision of the cosmos in which there's a kind of mimesis of different levels of reality, with like in Plato's divided line, in which there's a similarity at different levels of being. In essence, the body of the universe is created, that is coagulated, by means of proportion or analogy. Of course, in the Timaeus, there's the measuring bowl and so forth. Well, correlatively, in Rilke's coagulatio-infused new poems, there's no end to analogies. The things that Rilke represents, they're not really represented literally, usually, but by way of constant and constantly mutating an analogy with other things. For example, a swan's heavy stride is likened to the travail of life, and the creature's suddenly easeful glide in the water is likened to the release of the physical body in death. The gaze of the god Apollo is likened to the light of the sun shining through leafless branches in the morning, and on and on and on. There's just ubiquitous metaphor in the new poems. Most every poem is a composition of multiple analogies. And in another Apollo poem, the first of the second of Rilke's 2 volumes of new poems, both of them begin, interestingly enough, with poems dedicated to the god, not dedicated to, but representing the sculptures of Apollo, the god Apollo. And in the second of these, that begins the second volume of new poems, Rilke's statuesque poem takes on remarkable life and radiance, which may in turn stand for the creative power that may break forth from the apparently fixed lines of the densest, most coagulated material, like stone, and by extension from the whole volume of Rilke's new poems, so that these forms, these concretely realized forms, by no means are restricted in their influence to their outlines, but have a psychic force that shines through them. And I want to end actually by reciting for you the archaic torso of Apollo, which exemplifies this quality. The archaic torso of Apollo. We never knew his unheard of head, wherein the eye apples ripened. Still, his torso glows like a street lamp, fed by the gaze that, but turned in, will always hold its fire. Else the surge of the breast couldn't blind you, or the gentle twist of the loins reveal the invisible urge to smile that shudders through creation's midst. Else this stone would stand deformed and knifed off at the shoulder's steep rock face, and not ripple like a panther's fluid pelt, and not burst through form's constricting belt like a shining star. For there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. Thank you. So I'm not surprised we didn't have time to get to the elegies and sonnets. I more or less planned on that. But as a footnote, before we take questions, in terms of the progression of alchemical processes, as I alluded to before, the next great work that Rilke wrote was the Elegies, which is in many ways, many would regard as his most famous work. It's an intensely philosophical poem. And just as a kind of taste, the relationship to the element of air, and which goes along with the faculty of thinking, and the alchemical process of the sublimatio is quite marked in the Elegies. And it's the one time in my soul history where I actually go in depth into an alchemical process. There's almost the better part of a whole chapter that talks about the Elegies and the processes of sublimatio that go on in the Elegies. So this was actually planned as a sales pitch. If you want to know the next chapter of the story, the sublimatio and the great Elegies, you either have to buy the book or invite me back for another session. Or both, yes. And then there are the sonnets to Orpheus, which are my personal favorite. And again, there's some relationship to fire imagery, but even more importantly, I think it really is the place where Rilke realizes the greater conjunctio, the union of Orpheus and Eurydice, and the two halves of many universes come together in that utterly remarkable work. And both the Elegies and Sonnets are just remarkable works, and certainly require much more time than I could provide in this context. Unfortunately, it happens a little too frequently when I talk about Rilke the end of his career we don't quite get there because there's so much richness that isn't always recognized, you know, in the earlier phases of his work. So in the remaining time left, I would be more than happy to ask any to try and address any questions about anything that has come up today. Yes. Yes.
We have a question here from Claudette Gregg. In the end of the poem Autumn, there is a large hand who softly catches all the falling. What is the relation to the higher individual self that is formed after the dissolution and rebirthing in Rilke?
Well, that's a great question. She's referring to the poem Autumn, which we only gave in part here, and I don't think I have my book of hours. I could read the whole thing in German, but I don't think that would help. It's the poem that begins, let's see, what page of these handouts is it on? Oh, it's not on the handout, it's just in my notes here. Yeah, well, let me just find that for a moment. Yeah, so Autumn, just to refresh our memory, and I wish I had the whole poem, but I don't. But it's the poem that begins, the leaves are falling, falling as if from far away, as if distant gardens withered in the skies. They fall with gestures saying no. And in the nights, the heavy earth falls from a multitude of stars into aloneness. And it's true, as the questioner implies, the very end of this poem ends with a line something like, but there is one who holds all this falling in his hand. So there is a kind of recuperation of that falling away from fullness at the end of this particular poem. And I would say this is a poem of transition. I think it's written, you know, in the early 1900s, and in a way you could see that the God or the spirit that is catching everything at the end of the poem, hearkening back to the God of the Book of Hours, in which there's an ultimate unity that is restored. And you can think about it as well. Rilke's going through very difficult times, but he's still holding on to this image of the unifying God that manages, despite all this falling, all this death, all this destruction, to nevertheless hold everything as a unity. I think this particular poem I would see more as looking back towards kind of the God of the Book of Hours, rather than the maturer work in which there remains, I think one could say, you know, there's a new unifying force which occurs in the later Rilke works. It's not so much named as God, you know, there's the angel, there's Orpheus, but they're not as simple unities, and they're more complex, so that that's the way that I would see it. There is a kind of looking back towards the earlier unity that he's in the process of losing. At the same time, there is an adumbration that, well, this darkness, this negredo, is actually part of a process that embraces, you know, more and more and more, and it's all part of one process that the soul is. And I've tried to give a sense of that through the progression of the alchemical sequences, you know, in this talk. Good. It's in the Book of Images, das Buch der Bilder. Yes. Yes, it's another couple stanzas. Yes, a question here. Yes. Right. Well, that's a great question. Those are two of my very most favorite poets, if not my most favorite. You know, there's well, let's see. Williams' Spring and All is around 1921 or something, a little bit later. They're very different streams. Rilke was not very good with English. He was, you know, kind of uncharacteristic for a German. He did love Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets from the Portuguese and actually translated them. If you ever tried to translate anything, if you take a look at Rilke's translations, they're amazing, and from a language that he didn't even know well. But they're, to be more direct, both Rilke at this point in his new poems and Williams are certainly part of a larger movement of modern art, in which what I've spoken about in connection with Rilke, focus on the object, realization of the material quality of the things, they're very much part of that same zeitgeist. They have very different idioms in that the Americanism, the aggressive, wonderful Americanism of Williams, you know, no idea of things, but beyond that, is you know, radically different from Rilke, who had very little patience or respect for America, and in fact said that there were nothing but dummy things coming over from America, which didn't carry the soul quality that the European things had. And you know, there's a lot of truth in that, even more so today than you know, in his time. But so in terms of kind of actual influence or being of this same specific streams, no, but in terms of artistic impulses and going towards modern art, realizing the importance of the material, foregrounding the material, realization of particularity, they're very, very much related in that more general sense, both very much part of modernity. Yeah. Yes, please.
It's so gratifying, you know, that Rilke finally found a father.
Yes, yes.
He didn't have one for so long.
Yes.
And it really fits that coagula idea of what Rodin gave.
Yes, very much so. I mean, his own father was an important figure, your vexed relationship with him. In later life, he tended to look much more favorably on his father than his mother. But Rodin certainly provided a model of being, and indeed of masculine being, an authority that in a way that his own father didn't. So there's yeah, I mean, you look at Lou Salome and you look at Auguste Rodin, and these are two monumental figures, you know, an archetypal mother and father figures. And, you know, there's this myth about Rilke, in which there's, of course, a good deal of truth, you know, Santa Claus of loneliness, that he was a solitary poet. Well, he did love and live in many ways a solitary life, but his life is shot through and through with crucial relationships with so many people, and so many of his works would have been unthinkable without the inspiration and relationship with significant others of various sorts, Rodin, Lou Salome, imagine all others like Vera Ukama-Knoop, you know, Merlina. So this guy was in relationship, you know, even when he was withdrawing away from it. And the soul context of his amazing work is unthinkable without all of that soul energy. It's not the case that he's always out. I mean, usually when he's out there at some castle or, you know, Capri Island in, you know, Capri, there's usually 3 or 4 women around, you know, he's reading to at night and he's translating Dante with and so forth. You know, it's not really the you know, the John Patmos syndrome, you know, and that's good to keep in mind. At the same time, there are genuinely hermetic influences of flight from the alone to the alone. You know, they're both there, spirit and soul, and that's what makes him so remarkable and so full, I feel, is both of those. Yes, please.
You know any studies that compare Rilke and Yeats?
That's a good question. They're both sometimes talked about as the last romantics, you know, and there's certainly affinities between them. Yeats is another one of my favorite poets. I went on a Yeats pilgrimage to Ireland several years ago. And, you know, I don't know, one book comes to mind. I think there are probably any number of books that deal with both of them. Yeah, well, is that the big, oh, go ahead. No, the Poet and the Self, is that a book? Oh, there you go. The Poet and the Self, and who you don't remember? Yeah, I mean, well, great. There's one. I mean, there are, I think, any number of literary critical texts, because they're both such towering figures in early modernity. You know, it's interesting how little Rilke, how important he is, how beloved he is in America these days, and how little cross-fertilization there was between Rilke and the English-speaking world during his life. You know, I mean, the Germans adopt Shakespeare as one of their own. You know, Schelling and Schiller and Goethe are unthinkable without Shakespeare, their dramas and so forth. But Rilke and the English language world didn't have much to do with each other. Yeats was another one of those poets like Blake who was very consciously interested in esotericism, the Golden Dawn and so forth. Rilke draws his inspiration, I think, and Rilke and Yeats was also aggressively a public figure, a national poet, right, of Ireland, a great playwright. Rilke was a failed playwright. He began writing plays when he was very young and fancied himself a man of the theater. But none of his plays are very good, and he gave it up and thankfully realized his genius lay elsewhere. So there are affinities and yet also dramatic differences in the profiles of these two, both great poets, both of whom work a lot with, you know, continue to work into the modern age with rhyme, you know, which is noteworthy.